Mr. President, I appreciate that. I was hoping to have a little bit more time this morning, so I'll cover this a little faster than I normally would, but it's so critical. I just got back from the Middle East, and I know the problems that are over there, and a lot of people are saying that the gas prices that are going up are a result partially of what's happening over there. That isn't the real problem. The real problem is a political problem. Let me first of all talk about the commitment that this administration has to cap and trade. Some people who have been around for a while can remember that way back at the Kyoto Treaty, I kind of led the opposition to ratifying that treaty, and then later on, for the next 10 years, they tried to pass cap and trade legislation. And since I chaired the committee at that time of jurisdiction, we looked at it and we thought, this isn't going to work, even by the admission of the Environmental Protection Agency. If we were to pass something like this in the United States, it wouldn't have any effect on reducing greenhouse gases. So I just would say this, something's happening this morning over in the House. They're looking at this issue, and we have introduced a legislation that has said that the EPA does not have the jurisdiction to regulate greenhouse gases, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But my message simply today is the higher gas prices are simply a product of this administration's goal. Just a minute ago, the minority leader said something that he quoted Stephen Chu, Secretary of Energy, and in that quote he said, quote, somehow we have to figure out a way to boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe. Do you know what it is right now in Europe, Mr. President? The United Kingdom, $7.87 a gallon. Italy, $7.54. France, $7.50. That's what this administration wants to do with our gas prices, and they have a motive for doing that. I think this, I can't just stop talking about the cap and trade agenda until we realize how it does affect things. You might remember, Mr. President, that back during President Obama stated when he was running for office in 2008 and then restated it several times, he said, under cap and trade, electricity prices would necessarily skyrocket. And he had it right. The whole point of that it would skyrocket if we were to pass that. But that also has effect on all forms of energy. The House Energy and Power Subcommittee is voting this morning on the Energy Tax Prevention Act, which I introduced in the Senate, and it's introduced by Congressman Upton in the House. Now, the bottom line of the Energy Prevention Act is the EPA to make it so that they do not have the jurisdiction to do what they couldn't do legislatively. Let's remember what they tried to do. Starting with the Kyoto Treaty and all the way up to for the following 10 years, they tried to pass in 2003 and 2005 and 2008 and 2009 a similar type of cap and trade. Now, what is the cost of cap and trade? The cost is, and this goes all the way back to the Kyoto Treaty, and when we have the estimates from the Wharton School, from MIT and many others, it would cost between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, what that translates in my state of Oklahoma to $3,000 a year for each family who files a tax return. Now, what do you get for it? As I said a minute ago, by the admission of the Obama EPA, and that's Lisa Jackson, in response to a question that I asked live on TV, that it's going to be, it wouldn't, I said, what effect would this have on worldwide emissions of CO2? And the answer was, well, it really wouldn't, because that only affects the United States of America. Now, here's the reality. It could actually increase it, because as our jobs go overseas, they go places like China and Mexico, and places where there are fewer emission controls. So it could have just the opposite effect. But nonetheless, I say this because there are people wandering around out there that say that we should do something about emissions, and yet I want to make sure that those people are listening, and that even if we did this, it wouldn't have any effect on their hope is that if we restrict enough supply, the price will increase, and we can then simply shift to what they call green energy. You know, I think it's important that people understand that the Republican position on this is, yes, we want green energy, we want renewables, but we also want coal and natural gas and nuclear and oil. These are the things that can run America today, and this is what we are doing. You know, if we, back in Oklahoma, they're logical people, so they ask a question, you know, what would it be if we were to, if they don't want oil, they don't want gas, they don't want coal, how do you run this machine called America? The answer is, you can't. Now, let me just state unfortunately, there isn't the time I was hoping there would be, but just some, it's not just the administration, not just Secretary Chu, but others in the administration. The Alan Kruger, the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy, he said the administration believes that it is no longer sufficient to address our nation's energy needs by finding more fossil fuels. They're anti-fossil fuels, and yet they admit the tax subsidies they call are currently provided the oil and gas industry. They lead to inefficiency by encouraging an overinvestment in domestic resources in this industry. But this is the critical thing right here. It's an admission, and this came from Alan Kruger. Quote, the small change in domestic producer costs, which I call a tax increase, could cause some production to shift from domestic to foreign suppliers. There it is, folks. That means we would have to depend on the Middle East to depend more to import more of our energy from the Middle East. By the way, I think it's important to note that the Congressional Research Service, and I think we all respect the work that they do, they came out with a report, and they have stated, and no one has been able to refute this yet, that the United States of America now has the largest supply of recoverable reserves in gas, oil, and in coal. Now, we keep hearing people say it's only 3% of the amount and we're using 25% of energy, we're producing 3%. That's just flat not true, and I think people understand that, because they use that as proven reserves. You can't prove reserves until you drill, and we have a political problem that the Democrats don't want us to drill. And now, if in that case, we have to fall back on the other way of looking at it, and that is recoverable reserves. And I would say this, that we're in a position right now to have the recoverable reserves, as this chart shows here. This is the recoverable reserves that we have right now. This is America's true oil potential. This is what we could produce here, and this is the proven reserves that they talk about. Well, the bottom line is we have, and I don't think anyone, I think it's incontrovertible, we do have the world's largest supply of oil, gas, and coal. This chart here shows that the amount of oil, gas, and coal that we have is greater than that of China, Iran, and Canada, all three put together. Now, this is what we've got here. And so people say, wait a minute, if that's the problem, why are we importing from foreign countries? We're importing from foreign countries because we have a political problem. We have a majority in this Senate, and they had a majority in the House and the President, who are trying to continue this policy of not allowing us to develop our own resources. We're the only country in the world that doesn't develop our own resources. Now, I do know that there are a lot of problems out there. I do know that we are going to end up certainly we have problems in the Middle East and all that, but when I go home and I talk to my wife, the number one problem is what she's paying for gas. And it's not going to get any better unless we can reduce it. How many people went to school and didn't learn about supply and demand? We have all the supply we need in the United States of America when you add what we get from Mexico and Canada to be totally independent from the Middle East. But they won't let us develop it. Well, 83% of our federal lands right now is off limits, and it's a political problem because they won't want to do it. I can remember when we had the oil spill down in the Gulf. Some of the far left environmentalists were rejoicing that it happened. They're rejoicing because they could parlay this into not allowing us to drill for our own natural resources. Finally, last week, the EPA issued its first permit for deepwater drilling in the Gulf. That was due to a lot of the political pressure that's been put on and a realization that the American people are not as dumb as they think they are, and that we can develop our own resources and we can resolve this problem.